And I don't do many lives, but now I figured out that instead of actually recording a video on my phone, I can actually go live and do this same thing. Because I'm out of storage on my phone. That's why I haven't been doing any videos. I'm just out of storage. I can't figure out how to get the videos off of my phone and put them onto a storage disk or whatever. Because every time I hook my phone up, it says that it can't read my files or something's going on. But anyway, what I really wanted to talk about was the validity of the New Testament. Why do people say that the New Testament is false, or why do people say that it's fabricated, from the Roman Empire? Why do people believe this is true? So I don't know why people believe it's true, because it's not. And it's a ridiculous concept to even consider, because no scholar anywhere, recognizes the New Testament as a fraudulent book. Do you see what I'm saying? All the scholars everywhere consider the New Testament to be from the Hebraic community of the first century. If you know anything about New Testament history, it is a document that emerges from the Hebraic community of the first century. It can't be any other thing. I mean, there are so many hallmarks in the text that let us know, who it came from and where it came from and when it came from. And I could go over point by point, a lot of these different hallmarks, one of them being the specific Roman rulers that were in, power at the time, the beginning of the first century in Jerusalem, which governors would be where. Pontius Pilate has been identified in history. The Herods have been identified in history from this time period. The Caesars that were in power in that era have been identified and match. So it would be impossible to match up, not impossible, but improbable to match up all of these different characters from outside of the Hebraic community to overlap over this event. Do you see what I'm saying? It would be an impossibility to put together, right? Not only that, you've got the languages that we're dealing in. We're not dealing in Latin, we're dealing in Greek and Hebrew, right? You have very, very early on a testimony of who they call the church fathers of a Hebrew Matthew. And I believe it's Jerome and Origen and all of these different guys, 4 or 5 separate witnesses that attest to the first gospel being the Gospel of Matthew, and that it was first, of course, written in Hebrew because it comes from the Hebraic community. You have this attested to all the way up to into the 2nd century, and I can't remember which of the quote unquote church fathers was the one who identified it in the 2nd century, but clearly Origen in the 3rd century, and then Jerome, I believe, in the 4th century, coming in after that. So very, very early on, Hebrew Matthew, and of course there would be a Hebrew Matthew, just because these books are coming from the Hebraic community. We know that the Gospels were written first in Hebrew, right? And then anything following along, written by any other author or written by Greek authors or rewritten by Greek authors. Do you see what I'm saying? Or written for Greek audiences. Anything later on, would be considered later works. And what we have is an early Matthew, and then you have maybe some Greek counterparts later on, in Mark and Luke, and not John, but Mark and Luke. So that's what you're looking at. And you're looking at the languages that you would expect, because the Hebrew world was conquered by Greece in the time before the Messiah. So you have a lot of Greek-speaking Hebrews, right? You don't get Persian in the New Testament. You don't get Latin in the New Testament. Persian is too early, Latin is too late. You get Greek and Hebrew, right? And so that's what you would expect. You get, what do you get in the book of Daniel? You get Aramaic, and oh, you do get Aramaic in the New Testament as well. But what do you get in the book of Daniel? You get Aramaic and Hebrew, right? If you guys know the book of Daniel, I believe it starts in chapter 2, where it switches from Hebrew to Aramaic, and then it goes all the way up until chapter 8 in Aramaic, and then it switches back over to Hebrew in chapter 9, right? And so we know that looking at the languages of the text is one way to both authenticate the text and then date it itself, right? And so if we look at what was going on at the time that Daniel claims that it was written in, we know that the Hebrews had been captured by the Babylonians. And so it makes sense that half the book is written in Aramaic, because Aramaic is the language of Babylon, right? And so that's one way that we, find in time where these books are written and when, right? Outside of what the book itself says. That's how we authenticate it beyond what the book says about itself, right? So biblical book or not, things do need to be authenticated. And one way we do that is, okay, what does the language say about what time period this is? And what's interesting about the Aramaic in Daniel is that it's something called Imperial Aramaic, which is, pointed to an early, is it an early Babylonian? So it specifically dates to that point in time that Daniel claims to be from, right? And if you go even beyond that, if you go to the Torah, if you study it Hebraically, if you study it in Hebrew, has more Egyptian words in it, Egyptian loan words, than any other book, right? It's littered, it's filled with Egyptian loan words. We know that because there have been several studies on the Egyptian from the era of Moses, right? And what they found was that same style of language was used in the Bible, but only during the Torah time period. So a lot of that, language that was around during the writing of the Torah ceased to be, because this is, you're losing your Egyptianness going from one community to the next, right? And so we see that in the Torah. It's reflected directly in the Torah by the style of Hebrew that's being used. That this is a culture that must have been embedded in some sort of Egyptian mentality, because of the amount of Egyptian loanwords that are used in the Torah. This is how we date the Torah, and this is how we authenticate it, right? So at some point in time, some Hebrew people, whoever wrote the Torah, were also embedded in Egyptian understanding. It's a fact. This is what I mean about the Bible. It's a fact. And so you look at those just two things, right? Those two examples of how that you can use the language itself to authenticate the book. And then you look at the New Testament and you see it written and distributed in Greek as well as Hebrew, which is what the Hebrews of that time would need, right? So if you're writing a book about the history of the Hebrew people today, what language would you write it in? You wouldn't write it in Hebrew, because guess what? The Hebrews don't speak Hebrew anymore, right? We are the Hebrews, the African Americans. We're the Israelites. We're the quote unquote Jewish people. And we don't speak no Hebrew at all. So if you're going to write it about us, for us, to us, you'd write it in English. You see what I'm saying? So this is what we see in the New Testament. We see all of the aspects historically. We see all of the aspects linguistically, and then we see it all culturally too, because the Messiah is a part of the Hebrew culture, right? You can't just look at the New Testament and say, oh, I don't believe in the Messiah because he doesn't fulfill these specific circumstances in your mind. In order for you not to believe in the Messiah, you have to erase Messiah from the Old Testament. You have to erase the concept of Messiah from the Old Testament. You have to understand that there are predictions in the Old Testament that rely on the New Testament fulfillment. Do you see what I'm saying? You wouldn't have an Old Testament prophecy without the New Testament fulfillment, because the concept of Messiah still exists. The concept of a supernatural entity, right, that in one day in the future will lead the world, right, that is not Yah Elohim, but a whole different entity that is not alongside him, but just underneath him. If you remove that from the Old Testament, you don't have any angelic understanding, right? Or most of it. And not only that, the concept that he would come and rule the earth is there as well. So if you don't have these prophecies in the Old Testament about a Messiah coming, you wouldn't have the Messiah coming in the New Testament. So in order to get rid of that New Testament Messiah, you have to also get rid of the Old Testament Messiah. Because in the book of Isaiah, it says, in the book of Isaiah, it says that is going to come somebody with the government on his shoulders who will be called the Everlasting Father, the Mighty Elohim, the Wonderful Counselor, right? Who is this person that is a mighty Elohim who will have the government on his shoulders, who's going to be on the earth? It's not the Father that's in heaven. That's not it. It's a whole different entity, right? If you go a little bit further on, it tells you even more about the entity. It says that he will come from the line of Jesse. He will come down through the line of Jesse. There will be a stump and a root in Jesse, right? And people can talk about who his father is and all of this. He was brought into the house of David, directly into the house of David. And whether he was the blood son of Joseph or not, he was raised in the house of David as an adopted son of David. That's important too. That's important also, that his line, when he would say, where are you from? I am from the line of Judah. That's what Yahusha himself would have said. You understand what I'm saying? So if you understand the level of prophecy that you're dealing with here, you'll understand some of these concepts. It says in the book of Micah that there was going to come a ruler out of Bethlehem, Judah, who would be from everlasting. What does that mean? What does it mean to be from everlasting, to be of old, and be a ruler to come out of Bethlehem? What does that mean? Right? In the Old Testament, when you see that, before the instance of Messiah, what were you thinking, right? What did you think about what that meant? There has to be something special going on, because to be from old and from everlasting is an important thing, right? That's not something that is used in any other context except in a divine nature, right? That's where the term olam is used to be in a forever fashion, right? To be from old is to be something that is beyond human, right? And to be from Bethlehem means to be human, and then being from old means to be beyond human. Do you understand that's not in the New Testament? That's not in the New Testament. So explain that in Old Testament terms without a Messiah, right? So the concept of Messiah goes beyond supernaturalism too. It's built into the fabric of the nation. Do you understand that there was a Messiah for literally every generation of Israelites? Almost every generation had a form of Messiah, right? So Mashah, the term Musha, which we think of as an Egyptian term because the Egyptian princess uses it and names Moses this name. And we know that it is an Egyptian concept, right, that the Egyptians understood because they had it in a lot of names, right? Like King Tut was King Tutmosis, right? And so Tutmosis and Moses had the same name, right? And that brings up a lot of different stuff. But besides that, going on down in this, not Egyptian context, but this Hebraic Egyptian understanding, you have the name Musha. And Musha literally means to deliver, right? And it's a root form, but it has a partner in the term Mashiach, which means deliverer, right? So if you're delivered from the water, as in Musha or Moshe, then it's the same concept as having a deliverer come and deliver you from any situation, right? And so if you look at the book of Judges, you have an entire book that is based on the concept of the Mushiach, right? And it's a form of a word. As far as the Nikud, the modern Nikud vowel point system is concerned, it's a form of a different word. But what you end up with is Mushiach, right? When you use this word, right? And so you have in these successive generations these Mashiach that come and deliver Israel, like Samson, like Othniel, like Yapta, like all of these different people that at one point in time delivered Israel, right? And so you see that in most generations, that especially in the ones of extreme turmoil, that a Moses is risen up, right? That a Musha is risen. Do you see what I mean? So that concept is there in Israelite history going all the way to the current era. Because if you look at, what the FBI are looking to come out of the black community in America is a black Messiah. Think about it. They're still looking for the Messiah to be risen up out of Israel, right? This is not something that is new. The concept of a Messiah is not a new concept, nor is it exclusive to the Messiah, because there were many Messiahs that were risen up to deliver Israel. Even Cyrus was called, who was a king, who was a general of the Persian army, was called a Messiah, right? A Messiah that came from another nation to do exactly what our Messiah does for us, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So to remove the concept of the Messiah from your mind in order to make this New Testament Messiah null and void is historically and culturally counterproductive, because you can't remove it from the Israelite society. It's always been there, right? And then the coming of a supernatural Messiah that's going to rule forever is clearly a biblical concept. Daniel, right? Daniel 7, right? Do you guys understand that you have to remove Messiah from the Old Testament in order to justify removing his New Testament fulfillment? Because otherwise you don't have a fulfillment in any other sort of Messiah, right? Right? So these are some of the reasons why the New Testament is just critical. It's just critical for your understanding of Hebrew culture. Because without it, without the understanding that you need this, you end up in the state that you're in now, Messiah-less. You see what I'm saying? That no one can save you. Because if you're dependent upon a Messiah that is to come to be different from this one that we already have, then you are without a sacrifice and living in vain, because you can't worship in a state where you don't have a temple. You can't worship in a state where you don't have some security for your sinfulness, right? That's not how you worship. That's not how you've ever worshiped as a society. You've always worshiped in the sacrificial system. That's what you've always done. So how can you justify not doing that now? Wherever you are, I mean, even Job was offering sacrifices, right? Am I right? So the concept that you can exist in some sort of sinful state or semi-sinful state or renewed state outside of the kingdom without any sacrifice or without any, you know, mediator for your sinfulness is not something that Israel has ever done. Unless, and I mean, while they've been in captivity, yes, for sure. But even then, with an understanding of what was going on and who was where. Do you see what I'm saying? So you don't have that system anymore. You don't have anything near it, right? If you're existing in captivity, in a state of sin or in a state of uncleanness, you don't have any way to fulfill those obligations that you have in debt for your sin, right? There's no way to do it. So I say all that to say that it is very, 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 very convenient that in the state of sinfulness that we're in, we have a sacrifice that is greater than the temple, greater than the bulls and the goats and the lambs that we once sacrificed in order to try to get us clean for a year, right? Is greater than all of those different things. And since we're in the state that we're in this, 2,000-year captivity, or a series of captivities, we've needed a Messiah, right? We've needed one. And guess what? In the first century, we destroyed our own. As it was prophesied, we destroyed our own. And ever since then, we've been scattered across the world. We've been in captivity after captivity. Every time we start to get up in society, we are pushed down, going all the way back to as far as you can see. And what's the what is the similarity between all of these different captivities that we've been in? Well, we've been in them without the Messiah. Do you see what I'm saying? We've been through all of this without the Messiah. And our last stop in America has beaten the Messiah into us so deeply, that we can't conceptualize anything else but, right? Even in its false image, we can't accept anything but. But, historically, it's going to help because we've needed a Messiah. See what I'm saying? Okay, you guys, I'm sure that's all that I've got for you, but it does bother me when people don't do the accessory research to back up the claims that they're saying. If people are going to say that the New Testament is a Roman forgery that is plagiarizing the Old Testament, you've got to put some sort of sauce behind that. You've got to put something solid, some evidence for that to be the case. Because if you're just, saying it because you don't like the nature of the New Testament, then, it's just forging your own reality. Because the reality of the New Testament is that it comes from the Hebraic community, that it's an essential part of the Hebraic community, that the writers of the New Testament were all Hebrews. And there's just no way around that. Okay, I guess that's all I got, guys. Shalom, shalom.